Catherine Dawson, Cat, to everyone who mattered, sat in the worn wooden chair outside the Thompson boarding house, with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had brewed herself. Because Widow Thompson was not the kind of woman who brewed tea for somebody else, without reminding you of the charity in it. The morning air still carried a chill, the particular Georgia chill of early April that pretended at winter a little longer than it had any right to. She had grown used to it. She had grown used to a great many things since the war had taken everything her family owned and left only the people behind. And then the war had come back around and taken most of those too. She sat and she thought, the way she had been doing too much of lately, and she let herself feel the weight of the baby shifting low in her belly. A weight that was becoming less abstract and more urgent with every week that passed. 7 months. She was showing so badly now that even the boarding house tomcat had started giving her a wide berth, as if the whole situation made him uneasy. She thought about Thomas. Thomas Wade had ridden out of Jonesboro at 17, with her brother Johnny at 16. The two of them sitting straight in their saddles the way boys do when they are terrified and will not admit it, headed toward a war that everyone said would be brief. She had been 13, and she had stood at the edge of the road in a dress she was already outgrowing, and she had watched the dust swallow them up. And even then, even at 13 with her heart crammed full of more feeling than she had words for, she had understood that the dust might keep them. It had kept her father, it had kept her mother in a slower and sadder way. The Union Army came through and burned the Dawson plantation down to the chimney stones, and her father had died trying to stop them with a hunting rifle against a column of soldiers. Which told you everything you needed to know about James Dawson as a man. He was proud and he was brave and he was not, in the end, practical about odds. Her mother had lasted another 1.5 years before grief finished what the soldiers had started. Thomas had come back. He had come riding back into Jonesboro when Cat was 17, quieter than he had left, slower to smile, with a look behind his eyes that she recognized because she had the same one. It had taken him 2 years to work through enough of whatever he was carrying to show up at her Aunt Odell's door with his hat in his hands and ask if he could court her. He had said the only reason he came back instead of riding west with Johnny was because he knew she was there waiting, and he had made Johnny a promise to take care of her. She had held that for a long time. She was still holding it. They had worked and saved and bought 20 acres just west of the old hardened plantation, and they had built a cabin. And they had been building a proper house when Thomas started making noises about getting married in Atlanta, because there wasn't anybody in Jonesboro who could do it legally. She had not waited on Atlanta. She had waited long enough for Thomas Wade. She had looked him in the eye one night in that 12-by-12 cabin and said the words herself and told him they were married, and he had laughed and said yes ma'am, and that had been that. Living in a 12-by-12 cabin through cold Georgia nights had made virtue something you talked about more than you practiced. She had no apologies for that. She supposed the Lord, if he were paying close attention, understood something about human nature that the preachers liked to skip over. She had not told Thomas because it was early and she was being careful with hope that she was carrying his child. He had died not knowing. She turned that fact over regularly, like a stone that had no good side to it. Joe Hayes had found Thomas shot dead on Bear Creek Road one October morning, and Sheriff Taylor had ridden out to the cabin to tell her. And she had heard the words come out of his mouth, and then she had run. She couldn't have told you where she was going. She just ran, 50 yards down the road as if she could get far enough from the words to make them untrue, and then her legs gave out and she went down into the dirt, sobbing with no one around to pull her up. She had been at the boarding house since then, working for room and board, no wage, Widow Thompson having made it plain without apology that she did not normally take in unwed mothers and certainly did not pay them. Kat had listened and said nothing because she had no ground to argue from. But she thought about it sometimes, about how if she were not pregnant, she would have kicked that old woman's ass right there in the street and felt righteous doing it. The sun was coming up bright and clear that same morning, and Willa Hargitay was already walking. She moved along Bear Creek Road with the particular unhurried purposefulness of a woman who had timed this walk down to the minute. An hour from her shack to Murphy's General Store, and she had learned there was no use in rushing it. Georgia weather would be what it was, cool now, hot later, and uninterested in your opinions about either. She was thinking about Kat. Kat had been her closest friend since they were girls, the two of them inseparable in the way plantation daughters tended to be when they were neighbors, and there weren't many other options. They had been a study in contrasts even then. Kat with her long black hair and dark blue eyes, and the quick temper that could go from warm to scorching in the blink of an eye. And Willa with the reddish auburn hair, and the violet eyes, and the slow, measured drawl that made her sound like she was thinking things over even when she wasn't. She thought about Kat's big belly and smiled a private smile. Kat had told her last week that she felt like a seed tick on a dog, full and swelled, and Willa had laughed until her sides ached. She was thinking about something else too, though she was trying not to. She was thinking about Johnny Dawson. She had been 12 years old when Johnny and Thomas rode out to join the Confederate Army. And she had been a gangly red-headed girl with blonde bangs she kept in pigtails and a slightly crooked tooth, and enough freckles to count. She had understood, even then, that a girl like that was not the kind of girl that someone like Johnny Dawson would think about. He was handsome in a way that struck you like a physical thing when you looked at him. The dark eyes, the jaw, the quiet economy of movement that made everything he did look intentional. Him and Kat both had that quality, that absolute striking quality that made people look twice without knowing why. She had been 12 and foolish, and she had watched him ride away, and she had thought, when he comes back, I will be different. She was different. The freckles had mostly gone. The pigtails were long gone. The tooth had straightened. The bosom had arrived, bigger than Kat's, which Kat acknowledged cheerfully and without jealousy, because Kat was constitutionally incapable of jealousy about such things. Willa had grown taller and her hair had gotten fuller, and she had become, by most honest reckonings, a striking woman. Unusual, yes. Different, certainly. But striking. Johnny had not come back. She was thinking about this, and about the conversation she'd had with Kat yesterday about baby names, when the sound of a man's voice cut through her thoughts. Morning, Miss Albino. It was Joe Hayes, sitting on a donkey and headed toward the livery, with that flat, disrespectful tone that he reserved specifically for her. He was the middle Hayes brother, dark-complected in a way that betrayed his origins. His mother had been a slave on the Thompson property, his father the late Mr. Thompson himself. Though nobody said that out loud. It made Joe Hayes look like a white man who'd been left in the sun too long, and it made him mean in a specific, particular way that Willa had learned to recognize. Morning, Mr. Mulatto, she said pleasantly and kept walking. She heard him make a sound behind her. Good, let him chew on it. The word albino still landed on her like a small stone every time someone threw it. She had been called it her whole life, owing it to the particular accident of her birth and the particular ignorance of Widow Thompson, who had seen the Hargitay baby developing jaundice at a few weeks old, and announced to anyone who would listen that the child was an albino. 22 years later, the label had stuck. Willa was not an albino. She had bright violet eyes which were unusual. Her lips were a slightly deeper shade of lavender than anyone else's she had ever seen, and the same tint appeared on her palms and certain other places that no one had occasion to observe. Her hair was reddish auburn with blonde at the ends of her bangs, as if the sun had bleached them differently than the rest. Her skin was pale, not white pale, just pale, and it flushed an extraordinary color when she was embarrassed, a deep rose that traveled up from her collarbone like a tide. She had come to hate Jonesboro. The freed slaves who made up most of the remaining population were decent enough to her, but she could feel the low simmer of satisfaction some of them took in her reduced circumstances. She didn't blame them exactly. She understood it, but understanding something didn't make it comfortable to live inside of. She had thought about going west. She had even written some letters through a mail-order bride agency 2 years ago when she was 20. She had written to a few men and felt foolish about it almost immediately. She had finally decided she was not going to travel 1,000 miles to marry a stranger on the spot. She had never even kissed a man. Kat had told her that Johnny was a rancher in Wyoming now. Willa quickened her pace slightly, as if she could walk ahead of her own thoughts. Kat was waving from the bench in front of the boarding house when Willa came into sight of it, waving with that whole-arm enthusiasm that she had always had, as if her body couldn't contain the energy of it. Willa walked over and gave her a hug and a peck on the cheek and put her hand on the belly. She had taken to doing that lately, without quite deciding to, and said, "Kat, darling, I had planned on seeing you today. How are you feeling?" Kat's eyes were wide and bright. "I've got news," she said. "I got a letter from Johnny." Willa felt her heart take one hard beat against her ribs and then resume at a different pace. "How's he doing?" she asked, keeping her voice easy. "You got time before your shift?" "I left early," Willa said. "I've got a while yet." Kat had a quality when she was about to say something important of leaning forward slightly, as if proximity would help the words land better. She did it now. "I wrote him after Thomas died," she said. "I told him everything, about the house and the cabin and Thomas and me saying our own vows, about Joe Hayes finding Thomas on the road, about the money being gone, stolen, the sheriff thinks, when they found the body, about living here and working for no wage and being 7 months pregnant with no husband and people whispering their gossip at me." She took a breath that hitched slightly at the end. "I told him I needed help. I told him I needed him." Willa understood what that had cost Kat. Kat, who would bite through her own tongue before asking for charity. Kat, who had been furious at Johnny for years, for going to war while she and their mother were left to manage, for not coming back when the war ended, for the long silence that had stretched from 1 year into 3, and 3 into 7. Kat, who had made Thomas swear on multiple occasions that if he and Johnny were writing letters, the letters had better include her name. "What did he say?" Willa asked. Kat held out a single folded sheet of paper. Willa opened it. 4 words. "Johnny's coming, baby sis." Willa looked up. Kat's eyes were bright with tears that she was not going to shed on a public bench. She was a Dawson, and Dawsons did not, but they were there, right at the edge. Willa felt her own eyes go strange and hot, and she wasn't entirely sure why, but she was crying too, just a little, just enough. They stood there on the main street of Jonesboro, Georgia, 2 plantation daughters in reduced circumstances, crying at 4 words on a piece of paper. After a moment, Willa wiped her eyes and asked, "What do you think will happen when he gets here?" Kat straightened. "J.D. Dawson isn't coming," she said. "He said Johnny's coming. And from what Thomas told me about the difference between the two, I think Joe Hayes is going to have some explaining to do." Willa blinked. "Joe Hayes? What's that bastard got to do with this?" Kat leaned closer. "I think he killed Thomas. Sheriff Taylor thinks so too. Can't prove it, no witnesses, and Joe had a story about finding the body. But he had extra cash after Thomas died, bought himself a donkey. Sheriff says he's nearly certain Joe stole the money when he found the body." She paused. "I think he did worse than steal. You think Joe Hayes actually killed him? I think Joe Hayes has been sniffing around me since I was 16 and has never once made his interest a secret. I told him to his face that I thought he was disgusting, and we had quite the scene about it on Aunt Odell Street. The poor woman blushed at language she hadn't known I was capable of. Willa almost smiled at that. Everybody who knew Kat knew she was a hellcat. And Thomas found out he'd put his hand on you. He put his hand on my. Kat glanced around and lowered her voice to something between a whisper and a hiss. On my backside. Right down there at the store. And when I told Thomas about it, Joe Hayes had a religious experience. A pause. Why am I just now hearing about this? Because Sheriff Taylor asked me to keep quiet while he looked into it, and because I wasn't ready to tell anyone a man like that had touched me. She looked at Willa steadily. Even with my dress between it, Willa felt the heat climb her face. Kat watched it happen with something that might have been affection. You have the most extraordinary skin tone when you blush, Kat said. Willa, to redirect from the blush, said, "What do you think Johnny will do when he gets here?" Kat sat up straight, the way she did when she had a list forming. "I want him to finish my house so I can sell it. I want him to put a bullet in Joe Hayes' head." She paused. "And I want him to take me back to his ranch in Wyoming." Willa was quiet for a moment. "Sell your house? Kat, you can't keep living in this boarding room. Where would you?" And then she caught up. "Wyoming. I want to escape this place," Kat said, and the plain honesty of it was the most Kat thing she had ever said. "I want to go somewhere where my baby won't be considered a bastard. I want a new life somewhere where being a plantation daughter doesn't make me an enemy. I don't belong in the South anymore, Willa. I haven't belonged here since the war." Willa recognized the reasoning. She had felt it herself for years, the slow erosion of belonging, the sense of being a woman from a place that had ceased to exist. "I'll miss you," she said quietly. "You're my only friend. I'm not sure what becomes of me just wandering around Jonesboro alone." "You are not going to do that." Kat's voice was firm. "If I go to Wyoming, you're coming with me." Willa laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her. "I'm sure Johnny wouldn't allow me to just tag along." "Thomas told me that Johnny is lonely," Kat said. "He's been trying to find himself a mail-order bride because men outnumber women 10 to 1 out there. He hasn't found one." Willa kept her voice very careful. "Why not? He was looking for a Southern belle. Most of the women using the service are from Boston and Chicago. Apparently that doesn't answer." Willa sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What's that got to do with me?" Kat took her hand. "Willa, we both know you were waiting for him the same way I was waiting for Thomas. We both know it broke your heart when he didn't come back. When he gets here, you blink those big violet eyes at him." "I'm the albino," Willa said, and it came out smaller than she intended. Kat's expression shifted into something that looked like she had been waiting years for this particular conversation and was not going to waste it. "You are not a damned albino. Stupid Widow Thompson doesn't even know what an albino is. But you know what I know. We grew up together. We swam at the same hole. We know what each other looks like, and we both know we are the same thing, female." She squeezed Willa's hand. "Your hair, your eyes, your lips, the way you look, doesn't make you ugly. It makes you uniquely beautiful. You are the closest thing to a Southern belle that Johnny Dawson is likely to see in his lifetime. You bat those eyes at him, Willa. He'll see you." Something shifted in Willa's chest. It was small and cautious, and she didn't want to call it hope yet in case that was hubris, but it was there. "I'll try," she said. She hugged Kat and hustled down to the store to start her shift. Back in her shack that evening, Willa stood in front of the small, cracked mirror she kept propped on the windowsill and talked out loud to herself. Because there was no one else to talk to, and she had found that the sound of her own voice was sometimes the only company worth having. "This damned shack," she said. She slept on a blanket on a dirt floor. She cooked over an open fire outside. She hauled water from the creek and filtered it through a screen to get the minnows and the crickets out. In warm weather, she wore an old sundress into the swimming hole to bathe, because you never knew when a Hayes boy might be watching. In cold weather, she took horse baths inside and froze through the whole operation. "A Southern belle," she said to the mirror. Her mother had been one. She supposed she would have been one too, if the war hadn't rewritten the terms. She looked at her simple dresses hanging on the peg by the door and said, out loud to herself, and to no one, what would I even wear to impress Johnny Dawson and make him think of me as a Southern belle? She didn't know it then. But the answer to that question would become something of a legend in Jonesboro, Georgia. Johnny Dawson sat across from Robert Scott in the Sarah O'Malley restaurant in Rock Springs, Wyoming, drinking coffee and talking about cattle, which was what they mostly talked about when they were together. Robert owned a ranch about the same size as Johnny's and had been born into ranching the way Johnny had been born into planting, which meant they understood different things about the same subject of making something grow. Johnny called him young Robert, though in truth there were only a couple of years between them. It had started as a joke and become a habit, and Robert bore it with the patience of a man who knew he'd earned the other man's respect in ways that counted more than age. Anna Scott came in while they were talking and sat down beside her husband. She was 5 months pregnant and glowing the way some women did, that particular warmth that pregnancy gave certain women, like they were lit from the inside. Johnny stood while she sat, as his mother had raised him to do, and then took his seat again. Anna had the most striking eyes he had ever seen on a woman, before or after. They looked into you in a way that most people's eyes didn't, and they looked into your desire while they were at it, which was disconcerting in the way that beautiful women's eyes sometimes were. She was Chinese and Irish, daughter of a brutal circumstance that Robert had told him about once with the weight of a man who'd carried the story for someone else and never set it down. Her story was a hard one, but to Johnny's eye it still felt tame compared to what he had lived. He had a long story to tell and a big favor to ask, and he had been waiting for Anna to arrive because he needed a woman's perspective on how to handle certain things. I need to talk, he said. And I hope you can help me. Robert looked at Anna and then back at Johnny. Tell me, Robert said. Let me start from the beginning, Johnny said, and he did. He told them about Jonesboro and the 2 plantations, and the war coming down on them like weather nobody had predicted. He told them about being 16 and able to shoot straight, and about the Sharp's rifle with the scope that they had given him, and the things he had done with it. He told them about Thomas Wade, his best friend from childhood, and about Kat, 3 years younger than him, a fireball, the apple of his eye since the day she was born. When the war was over, he said, I found Thomas. We rode about halfway home together. We were both in a bad way. He held the coffee cup and didn't drink from it. I told Thomas I couldn't go back. I couldn't let Kat see what I had become. He said she was the only reason he was going back. He asked my permission to court her with marriage in mind. I gave it. Then I turned north. Anna was watching him with those eyes. I haven't written to Kat, he said. In the 4 years I was fighting and the 3 years since, 7 years. Why J.D.? Anna asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I'm not J.D. Dawson, he said at last. I'm Johnny Dawson, and there are things I did that could follow that name all the way back to Georgia. But mostly, I haven't wanted her to know what kind of man I became. You said your brother-in-law wouldn't take money from you even though they really needed it. Why was that? Thomas said it was dirty money and he couldn't justify taking it. Maybe he was right. Tell me about the dirty money, Robert said. Johnny looked at Anna. I went north. I hunted Union officers. Men I knew had burned farms and plantations. Men who had foreclosed on property the way they did ours. I took everything they had. That's how I got my start. He stopped. I'm sorry, Miss Anna. Don't be, Anna said. Are you a wanted man? Not by the law. Maybe there are still men looking for me. But I've been careful. He told them the rest of it, about the mail-order brides he had been writing to and how he didn't bother to read them anymore. He had come home and after the Denver cattle drive, and the bride letters he had tossed on a shelf. Then when he had finally got around to reading them, there was the one letter written in a woman's hand that wasn't from a bride at all. It was from Kat. Thomas was dead. Kat was alone and 7 months pregnant and working for room and board. She had begged him for help. "I'm not sure what to do, Miss Anna. We were so close and I just deserted her. How do I do this?" Anna did not hesitate. "It's simple, Johnny," she said. "She's your sister. She needs you. She trusts you. She trusted you enough to write that letter. You forget about the past. You go to Georgia. You help her get her affairs straight. You help her have her child, and then you bring her here. You don't leave her in those conditions. J.D. or Johnny. I mean it, you bring her here." Robert said, "Here, here. What do you need me to do?" Johnny laid $400 bills on the table. "Keep my ranch above water while I'm gone. 3, 4 months. Robert put the money in his pocket and shook his hand. "Done." Before he left the table, Robert looked at him with the quiet directness of a man who said what he meant and didn't embroider it. "Even out here, I've heard of Johnny Dawson. Fastest draw. Best shot alive. Never heard outlaw or rustler, just dangerous. And I could tell that about J.D. Dawson from the first week I knew him." He paused. "For what it's worth, Anna and I think you're a good man." That look in Anna's eyes and the friendship he had found in these people made him want to be that good man they believed in. He walked to the post office and wrote Cat 4 words and gave the envelope to the postmaster to mail. Then he went by the train station and bought a ticket to Atlanta, and 3 days later he left. 2 days after Cat had received his letter, Johnny Dawson stepped off a train in the city of Atlanta. Atlanta smelled like smoke and ambition, and the particular kind of desperation that came from a city trying to rebuild itself faster than it could afford to. Johnny rented a horse at the livery near the station, a good roan with enough chest and leg for the road ahead, and a saddle that fit them both without argument. He slid his Sharps rifle into the saddle sheath and checked that it seated clean, the way he always did before a ride. The way he had done 10,000 times since the army had put the thing in his hands and pointed him at a line of distant blue coats and told him to make them disappear. He strapped on his gun belt, settled it where it belonged, and walked the horse out of the livery into the Atlanta morning. The road south to Jonesboro was 20 miles, give or take. He had ridden it in both directions enough times in his youth that his body remembered it, even if his mind had tried to put it away. The land came back to him in pieces as he rode, the red clay showing through where the grass thinned, the particular way the Georgia pines smelled after rain, the quality of the light through the canopy when the morning was still cool, and the afternoon hadn't gotten its hands on things yet. He let himself think about Kat. She had been 3 years old when he was 6, and had decided she was his personal responsibility, a decision he had made unilaterally and without consultation. And she had spent the subsequent years honoring that decision primarily by making it as challenging as possible. She had been the kind of little girl who climbed things that weren't meant to be climbed, argued positions she knew were wrong just to see if she could win anyway, and got into trouble at a frequency that suggested she was running some kind of experiment in it. He had loved her completely, he still did. He thought about what Thomas had written, what Thomas had reported about her over the years in the letters that had been his lifeline to a life he'd left behind. The way she had stayed by Odell's side through the old woman's illness, the way she had moved into Thomas's cabin and declared them married without waiting for anyone's permission or blessing. The way she had kept building the house even after everything had gone wrong, because Kat Dawson did not stop. She did not stop even when stopping was the rational thing. She was made of different material than that. He thought about her 7 months pregnant and working for room and board in a house run by a woman who considered that charity. He pushed the roan to a faster pace. He thought about what he owed her and what she had never asked for and what she had finally, after 9 years, asked for. He thought about the letter, those 4 words, and about what it must have cost her to write them. Cat who would rather fail on her own terms than succeed on borrowed ones. He was going to finish her house. He was going to deal with whatever needed dealing with regarding Thomas's death. And then he was going to take his sister and her baby back to Wyoming, where Robert and Anna were building something worth being around, and where Kat could make whatever kind of life she was capable of making, which his experience suggested would be a considerable one. He rode into Jonesboro in the early afternoon, and the town was smaller than he remembered, and the same as he remembered at once, the way a place always is when you've grown around it in your absence. The main street had the quality of a community at odds with itself, some buildings freshly painted, others abandoned. The population, a mix that told the story of the war, without having to say a word about it. He found the Thompson boarding house without difficulty. Widow Thompson answered his knock herself, which he supposed was what happened when you didn't pay your staff wages. She was a solid woman with a face built for disapproval, the kind of face that had probably been practicing that expression since early childhood. "I'm looking for Catherine Dawson," he said. "I'm her brother." The widow looked him over with the thorough skepticism of a woman who had heard a great many stories and believed approximately none of them. "She's working," she said. "Then I'll wait. This is a respectable establishment." He met her eyes and kept his voice even and pleasant. "Ma'am, I appreciate that. And I want to say something to you, in the spirit of honesty between neighbors." He let a beat pass. "My sister is living and working in your establishment without wage, 7 months pregnant, because she had nowhere else to go after her man was murdered. That is a circumstance that any decent woman would want to remedy as fast as possible." He paused again, that even voice never shifting. "I also know your late husband fathered children on the slave women of this property. So I'll be gentle with the word respectable, if it's all the same to you." The widow's face went through several colors in rapid succession. "I'll just come in and wait," Johnny said pleasantly and stepped past her. Kat came around the corner from the hallway carrying a stack of linens, and stopped so suddenly that the linens shifted and nearly toppled. She stood there for a moment, looking at him with those dark blue Dawson eyes wide and wet, and then she set the linens down on the hall table with great deliberate care. The way you set something down when you are afraid that if you don't do it carefully you will drop it. And then she crossed the room and put her arms around him. He held her carefully, mindful of the baby, his hand going to the back of her head the way it had when she was small and upset. And he felt the shaking in her shoulders that meant she was crying without letting him hear it. "Hey, baby sis," he said quietly. "Don't you dare call me that," she said into his chest, "and don't you dare let go." He didn't let go. After a while she pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand, and looked at him with the red eyes and the Dawson jaw, and the expression that said she had approximately 1,000 things to say to him and was choosing the order. "You look like hell," she said. "You look beautiful," he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, and then she cried a little more, and then she stopped and stood up straight and said, "Let me get my things." "All of them," he said. "You're not coming back here." They moved back to Thomas's cabin that afternoon. It was closer than he had expected to finish another month of work, maybe 6 weeks, and it would be a proper house. He walked through it with Kat and felt the weight of Thomas's work in the framing and the joinery, the care that had gone into it. "He was building it for you," Johnny said. Kat stood in the center of what would be the main room, her hand on her belly, and nodded. "I know. I'm going to finish it," Johnny said, "and then we're going to sell it and go to Wyoming." "Both of us?" Kat looked at him carefully. "Wyoming. I've got 5,000 acres," he said. "I've got good neighbors. I've got a town that doesn't care what side of the war your people were on, because most of them weren't in the war at all." He paused. "I've got room for you and your baby and whatever kind of life you want to build, and I want you there. Kat was quiet for a long moment. The late afternoon light came through the unfinished window opening and fell across her face. "Tell me about the people," she said. He told her about Robert and Anna. He told her Anna's story, the hard beginning and the long walk and the woman doctor, and the letter and Robert waiting at the end of it. He told her about the restaurant and Sarah O'Malley and Meng Chen, and the particular community that had grown up around Rock Springs. The way communities grow when the people in them are more interested in building things than arguing about history. Kat listened with her arms crossed and her head tilted, the way she listened when she was deciding whether she believed something. At the end she said, "Anna sounds like someone worth knowing." "She is," Johnny said. "And the baby," Kat's hand moved on her belly, "Thomas's baby. Out there, Thomas's son or daughter will be a Wyoming rancher's niece or nephew," Johnny said. "That'll be what they're known as." Kat looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right, Johnny." He went to find the sheriff that evening to make himself known and to hear what Taylor knew about Thomas's death. The telling took an hour and left him with a quiet, cold feeling in his chest that he recognized as the precursor to action. He had felt it before, many times in the war and after it. He didn't share what he felt with the sheriff. He just listened and nodded and thanked the man for his time. He went to bed in the cabin that night thinking about Joe Hayes, and about the particular kind of man who killed someone else's husband, and then bought himself a donkey with the proceeds. In the morning, he decided to visit his parents' graves before he started on the house. He wouldn't be coming back to Jonesboro once Kat was settled and the house was sold, and there were certain things that needed to be said over certain ground before a man moved on. His father's grave was on the far edge of what had been the Dawson property, marked with a field stone that someone had chiseled a simple D into years ago. The grave was maintained, the grass around it clipped, a handful of wildflowers, dried now, laid at the base of the stone. He stood there a while with his hat in his hand, and said what he had to say without saying it out loud, the way you spoke to the dead when you had things you weren't ready to put into words. His mother was buried half a mile to the east, on the edge of the old hardened plantation property, in a spot that had been chosen, he supposed, because it was available and it was quiet, and it was as close to the old home as they could manage without owning the land anymore. He rode there slowly. The grave was neat. Someone had kept it. He didn't know who, and the not knowing sat in him with a particular quality that might have been gratitude. He stood there longer than he had at his father's grave, because his mother had been a different kind of weight to carry. She had been alive when he left. She had been alive, and she had put her hands on his face and told him to come home, and he had not come home, and she had died in a town she hadn't chosen, in a house that wasn't hers, with no son beside her, and no land to be buried on that belonged to the family she had been born into. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said, out loud this time. He put his hat back on, took the reins, and headed back along Bear Creek Road toward Jonesboro. The sound came to him first. A rustle in the brush along the bank below the road, quick and urgent, the kind of sound that wasn't an animal in its natural motion. Johnny eased the roan to a stop and sat still and listened the way the war had taught him to listen, with his whole body and not just his ears. Another sound. Lower, a voice. He wasn't sure. He swung down from the saddle with the quietness of long habit and tied the horse to a pine sapling well back from the road. Then he unslung the sharps from its sheath. He had carried this rifle so long it had become something close to a limb. He felt the weight of it the way he felt the weight of his own arm, natural and constant. He moved to the tree line and settled into the shadow at the edge of the bank and brought the scope to his eye. The creek below was clear and shallow, maybe knee-deep at its center, running quiet over the stones. There was a woman standing in it. He kept the scope on her because he was looking for the source of the sounds, and it took him 3 full seconds to understand what he was seeing, and then he understood it completely. She was bathing. She was standing knee-deep in Bear Creek, completely nude, her back three-quarters turned to him, and she was the finest thing he had ever seen. Johnny Dawson had been to New Orleans before the war. He had seen women in a professional capacity in 3 territories. He had looked at women the way a man looks, all his life. He thought he had a reasonable accounting of what the female form was capable of. He had never seen anything like this. She was tall, nearly his own height, he reckoned, built with the kind of athletic fullness that made a man forget what he was supposed to be thinking about. Her hair was loose and dark reddish at the roots, lighter at the ends, hanging wet and heavy between her shoulder blades. She was angled away from him, scooping water with both hands, and the light off the creek made everything luminous. And her coloring. He had never seen anything like her coloring. There was a faint lavender tint at her elbows, where the skin was thin. He brought the scope to a different angle without thinking, the sniper's old habit of cataloging what he saw, and caught the same shade at the curve of her, lighter than the surrounding skin. Like the ghost of a color. She turned slightly, reaching for something on the bank, and he nearly stopped breathing. She was extraordinary. Not beautiful the way women were ordinarily beautiful, something past that. Something that hit him in the chest like a physical thing. He was about to lower the rifle, because he had no business looking, when a shadow moved at the edge of his scope. Joe Hayes came out of the brush on the far bank at a low run. Johnny had the rifle up and tracking before his conscious mind caught up to his hands. He watched Hayes cross the stones and grab the woman by the arm and yank her toward the bank with the grip of a man who had planned this, who had been watching and waiting. She screamed and fought. She was strong. She was fighting hard. But Hayes was larger and meaner, and he swung his free hand and hit her across the side of the face with the flat of his palm. And she went down onto the muddy bank and lay still. Hayes straightened over her and reached for his belt buckle. Johnny exhaled half a breath, the way he had been taught. The scope settled. "This ain't for you, boy," he said aloud, said it to the air, to the distance between them, to whatever accounting the universe kept, and pulled the trigger. The sharps boomed like a cannon in the morning quiet. The shot took Hayes dead center of his back and drove him forward, and he was dead before he finished falling. The blood that sprayed as he went down caught the unconscious woman across her shoulder and her hair. Johnny ran. He came down the bank fast and crossed the stones and reached her in seconds, dropping to one knee beside her. She was breathing. He checked her pulse and found it steady and strong. A welt was already forming along her cheekbone where Hayes had hit her, but her skull was intact and her eyes moved under the lids. She was alive. He sat back on his heels and looked at her and felt something he had not expected, a protectiveness so immediate and complete that it surprised him. Like a door opening in a room he'd thought was locked. She was covered in mud from the bank and the blood that Hayes had shed across her, and even so, he could not look away from her. Up close the coloring was even more striking. The lavender tint he had seen through the scope was real, a genuine quality of her skin, not a trick of the light. Her hair was extraordinary. Her face, even with the welt rising on her cheekbone, had a structure that would have been called classical if she had been anyone else, and was something better than classical because she was herself. He picked her up. She was not light and she was not fragile, and he was aware of both as he carried her to the edge of the creek and settled to his knees in the shallow water. He had to clean her. He did it with the care and efficiency that had nothing to do with anything, except that she needed it done, scooping the water with his hat, working it through her hair, wiping the mud from her face and neck and shoulders with his bandana. He kept his attention on the task. He was a deliberate man. She stirred once while he was working, a small sound escaping her, her hand moving toward her face. She didn't wake, but she was coming around. He carried her to the grass above the bank and found her clothes laid across a cypress root nearby. He set her down in the shade and placed her clothes within reach and stood up and turned his back. He stood looking at the tree line with his hands at his sides. He heard her wake, heard the changed quality of her breathing, the small sharp intake that meant consciousness returning with the abruptness it sometimes had. Then silence, the particular silence of someone taking stock. "Oh," she said softly, and then lower, "Oh Lord." He heard the rustle of cloth. He did not turn. She began talking to his back, and her voice was, he had not expected this, a slow, unhurried southern drawl of the deepest kind. The kind that had no interest in your schedule and would take its own time and expected you to adjust. "Sir," she said, "I want to thank you for what you did." A pause for breath, and he imagined she was dressing during the pauses, which she was. "I know you've seen me in a state that no man who isn't my husband ought to see me in, and I am profoundly mortified by that circumstance, and I apologize to you for it. Though I am aware the fault is not mine, and yet I apologize for the mortification of it anyway. Because that is how I was raised, and I cannot seem to stop." He pressed his lips together to keep from smiling at that. "And I can see that man there, which is to say I can see what's left of him, and I will not pretend I am sorry for what happened to him, because he was going to—" She stopped. "Well, you know what he was going to do, you saw it, and I am grateful you acted when you did." Another pause, longer, more rustling. "I'm decent," she said. He turned. She was standing in a simple dress, her wet hair hanging loose, her feet bare, the welt on her cheek darkening toward purple. She was looking at him with the largest violet eyes he had ever seen on a human being, and they were wide and startled, and then her mouth opened and she said, "Johnny." He heard her say his name. His actual name, the name barely anyone used anymore, said in that slow, deep Georgia drawl, and it took him a long second to make sense of it. "Johnny Dawson," she said, and she crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and put her arms around him and held on. He stood there for a moment with his hands raised slightly, the reflexive caution of a man who had spent years being careful about proximity. Then he put his arms around her and held her back because she was shaking and she needed to be held. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her. "You know me," he said. "Who are you?" She blinked those violet eyes at him. "I'm Willa," she said. "Willa Hargitay." "Willa," he said, and it came out nearly a shout. Because the name unlocked something. Because he remembered a gangly, red-headed girl of 12 who had followed him and cat everywhere like a faithful hound, and had the most extraordinary eyes he had ever seen on a child. And who had become the extraordinary woman standing in front of him, and his brain was not quite keeping up with the sum of it. He grabbed her by the waist and picked her up and spun her around, and she laughed, startled, and grabbed his shoulders. And he set her down, and they both stood there grinning like idiots in the middle of a crime scene. "Willa Hargitay," he said again, quieter, looking at her with the new eyes of the man he was now seeing the woman she had become. Her cheeks flushed that extraordinary rose color, and she looked away briefly, and he filed that away without deciding to, the way you filed things that mattered. He put her on the roan with him, his arm around her waist to keep her steady, and rode back into Jonesboro that way, and if anyone who saw them on the road had questions about the arrangement, his expression made it clear that the questions were not welcome. Willa sat in front of him with her hand braced against the saddle horn and said almost nothing for the first mile, which he suspected was unusual for her. He could feel the tension in her spine, the careful awareness of the proximity. He found Doc Harriman first and had the man examine Willa's cheekbone and her head while he gave his account of what had happened at the creek. The doctor said the cheekbone was bruised but not broken, and asked 2 or 3 questions that had to do with her vision and her clarity of thought. Willa answered them in that slow, unhurried drawl, and the doctor, who had been practicing medicine in Jonesboro for 30 years, looked at her and then at Johnny with an expression that said, He understood the situation well enough. Then Johnny went to find Sheriff Taylor. Taylor was a lean, weathered man who listened without interrupting, which Johnny had always considered the mark of a man who actually intended to do something with the information he received. He listened to the whole account. When it was finished, he said, "You got that man's blood on you?" "Yes, sir," Johnny said. "Sharp's rifle," the sheriff said. "Yes, sir. I have to go out there and look at it," Taylor said, "and write down what I see. And I expect what I write down will say that Joe Hayes was shot while attacking a woman, and the man who did the shooting saved her life and her virtue." He held Johnny's gaze. "I have been looking for a legal reason to deal with Joe Hayes for 6 months. God has an economy about him sometimes." "I expect he does," Johnny said. They shook hands. On the way back from the sheriff's office, he stopped at Murphy's General Store and bought a canvas tent, well-made, the kind that would stand weather. He bought a second horse from the stable, a brown mare with good legs and a steady disposition, and a saddle to go with her. He found Willa outside the doctor's office, sitting on the step with her hands folded in her lap and her bare feet on the ground below. Because somewhere in the proceedings, she had lost her shoes at the creek. "Here," he said, and gave her a pair of women's boots he had also bought at the store. He had guessed at the size. She looked at them and then at him and started to say something. "Try them," he said. They fit well enough. He brought the brown mare around and held the stirrup. "You're coming to stay with Cat," he said. "I bought you the tent. You can sleep in it on the property while I finish the house, and you've got the horse to ride back and forth to work." He paused. "And I need to tell you some things about what Cat and I have been talking about, because they concern you." She looked at him from the back of the mare with those violet eyes, very steady, waiting. "Cat is coming to Wyoming after the baby is born," he said. "We're going to sell the house and the land after it's finished, and I'm taking her back to my ranch." He held the mare's bridle and looked up at Willa. "The house will be yours if you want it. Or you can come with us." She was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light was in her hair. "I'll think on it," she said with that slow drawl. "Take your time," he said, and released the bridle and swung up onto the roan. He was aware, riding back toward the cabin, that he was aware of her, more aware than was practical. He kept his eyes on the road and thought about the things that needed doing. Kat's reaction to Willa's appearance, the bruised cheek, the borrowed boots, the borrowed horse, Johnny's carefully neutral account of the afternoon, was immediate and complete. She put her arms around Willa and held her the way only Cat could, which was with the total commitment of a woman who had decided something and was done deciding. Then she pulled back and looked at the cheek, and said some things about Joe Hayes that Johnny chose not to repeat later. Then she looked at Johnny over Willa's shoulder, and the look she gave him had layers in it. He chose to be busy with something in the corner of the room. That night, with Cat asleep in the cabin and Willa's tent set up in the yard within sight of the window, Johnny sat on the step in the evening dark and thought about what needed doing and in what order. The house first. He would need lumber and nails and glass for the windows, and he had the money for it. He would need to deal with the Hayes brothers, who he had no doubt would have opinions about what had happened at the creek, because men like that always had opinions and never had sense. And he needed to think about what had happened to him at that creek, in the 5 seconds before Hayes had come out of the brush. When he had looked through the scope at Willa Hargitay and felt something shift in his chest that had not moved in 9 years. He sat with it a while longer and then went inside and went to sleep. He worked the way he had always worked, steadily, early, without drama. He was up before the light each morning and had coffee made before Cat stirred. And by the time Willa rode out on the mare toward town for her shift at the store, he was already on the roof or at the frame or hauling lumber, depending on what the day required. The house came back to life quickly under his hands. Thomas had been a good carpenter, careful and square, and the bones of the structure were sound. It needed the upper bedroom finished, the windows seated and glazed, the porch framing completed, and a kitchen made habitable enough to cook in without feeling like you were doing it out of doors. Johnny was not a man who talked while he worked, generally speaking. He thought. He cataloged. He planned. What he thought about more often than was useful was Willa. She was different in the evenings than she was in the mornings. In the mornings, she was purposeful and quiet, in her riding clothes with her hair pinned, nodding to him as she passed with a small smile that was somehow both friendly and shy at once. In the evenings, she came back sun-warmed and a little tired, and settled into the life of the place naturally, helping Kat with supper, sitting on the step to pull off her boots. She talked more in the evenings, and the drawl got slower as the day unwound. And she had a quality of attention when you spoke to her, the kind of attention that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. He noticed the way she moved. He noticed the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. He noticed that she had a habit of touching her lower lip with one finger when she was reading, pressing it slightly, as if she were underlining the words with the gesture. He noticed that she looked at him sometimes, quickly, the kind of glance that was trying not to be caught, and then looked somewhere else. He filed all of this away. He talked to Kat about it one afternoon when Willa was at work, and they were eating cold biscuits on the half-built porch. "She's batting her eyes at me," he said. Almost deliberately. Kat's expression did something complicated. She pressed her lips together. Then she said very carefully, "What do you mean?" "I mean those violet eyes open up about twice their normal size when she's looking at me, and then she looks away. Like she's," he stopped, trying to articulate it, "like she's doing it on purpose." Kat was quiet for a second too long. "Kat, I might have told her," Kat said. "Before you arrived, I might have told her that if she batted those big violet eyes at you, you'd see her." Johnny looked at his sister. "I've been telling her since she was a girl that she's beautiful," Kat said, "and she's never believed me. I just wanted her to." She stopped. "You told a 22-year-old woman to bat her eyes at me." "I told a 22-year-old woman who has spent her whole life being called an albino and being made to feel like she wasn't worth looking at, that she was the closest thing to a Southern belle you were ever going to see, and that she should let you see her." Kat's chin was up. "I stand by it." Johnny was quiet for a moment, then he said, "All right." "All right." Kat's eyes narrowed. "All right," he said, and went back to work. That evening, he found Willa sitting on the step reading a book by the last light. He sat beside her, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, close enough that she went very still without looking up. "Willa," he said, "you don't have to bat your eyes at me anymore." She looked up. The violet eyes were, at that moment, about twice their ordinary size. "Kat told," she said, and the blush came up her throat and across her cheeks in that extraordinary color, that deep rose tide. "Kat told," he confirmed. He looked at her steadily, the way he looked at things when he wanted to see them clearly. "I see you, Willa. I'm telling you that plainly, so you know and you don't have to wonder. I see you. The real you, the way you actually are. Not the albino, not the thing people have been calling you all your life." He paused. "Do you understand me?" She held his gaze for a long moment. The blush hadn't gone down, but her eyes were steady. "I understand you," she said, in that slow drawl that he was finding more and more to be something he wanted to hear. "Good," he said. "Now tell me what you thought about while you were riding to work today. I could see you thinking when you left this morning, and I've been curious." She blinked, surprised, and then she laughed a real laugh and started talking. He sat beside her on the step in the fading light and listened. The Hayes brothers came on a Thursday. There were two of them left, Marcus and Eli, the older and younger of the three, built on the same model as Joe, but with different amounts of meanness distributed through them. Marcus was the smarter of the two, which was not high praise. Eli was the more dangerous, which was relevant information. They came up the road mid-morning while Johnny was on the roof nailing shingles, and he watched them come from up there and made certain assessments. He came down from the roof by the time they reached the fence line, and he stood in the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and waited for them to get to it. "You killed our brother," Marcus said. "I did," Johnny said. Marcus looked at him for a moment. He had presumably been expecting more negotiation. "Sheriff says it was clean." "It was. Sheriff says Joe was attacking a woman." "He was. That woman is living on this property." "Yes." Eli had not said anything. Eli was looking at Johnny with the particular look of a man who was calculating something and had not finished calculating it. "My brother is dead," Marcus said. "We want to know what you intend about it." "I don't intend anything further," Johnny said pleasantly. "Your brother is dead because he attacked a woman in front of a witness who was in a position to act. If either of you feels that calls for some response on your part." He let a pause sit. "I'd encourage you to think it through carefully before you act on that feeling." The pause stretched. Eli's hand moved slightly. Johnny's hand moved faster. He didn't draw, he just let his hand rest on the grip of his pistol, settled. The way a man's hand rested when drawing was something he could do without thought or hurry. Eli went still. Marcus looked at Eli and then back at Johnny and made, in that moment, a decision that was the smartest thing Marcus Hayes had probably ever done. He touched the brim of his hat, more reflex than respect, and turned his horse. Eli followed him after a moment. Johnny stood in the yard and watched them go until they were out of sight, and then he went back up on the roof and finished nailing shingles. That evening Kat asked him what had happened because Kat missed nothing. "They came and had their say," he told her. "And then they made a reasonable decision." Kat looked at him with those dark Dawson eyes that were the same eyes he saw in the mirror. "And if they hadn't made a reasonable decision?" "They did," he said. Kat held his gaze a moment and then nodded and went back to what she was doing, which was the Kat Dawson way of saying she understood and accepted the answer and trusted the man delivering it. The house was nearly finished by the time the conversation happened. It was a warm evening, the kind that comes in Georgia in May when the heat has arrived, but hasn't yet committed to the full punishment of summer. And they were sitting on the completed porch, Johnny on the step, Willow in the chair that he had built for Kat, and that Kat had seated for the evening because Kat had gone to bed early, which was happening more frequently as the baby moved closer to its time. They had been talking for an hour about various things, about the house and the work remaining, about the town, about nothing in particular, and the conversation had fallen into one of the comfortable silences that they had developed over the past weeks, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then Willa said, "Did you really advertise for a wife?" He glanced at her. "Who told you that?" "Thomas told Kat. Kat told me." A pause. "I'm surprised you didn't find one." "I was looking for something specific," he said. "A Southern belle." Thomas told Kat that too. Thomas told Kat everything apparently. Apparently. She folded her hands in her lap. "What is it about a Southern belle exactly that you were looking for?" "I've always known what the phrase means. I just wonder what it means to you." He thought about it. "It means a woman who takes her time with things," he said. "Who has a quality of stillness, I suppose, underneath everything else, even when she's in motion. Who has manners that come from genuine feeling rather than performance. Who can sit on a porch at the end of a long day and just be there without needing it to be anything other than what it is." Willa was quiet. "It means someone who talks like home," he said, and then stopped, because he hadn't planned to say that last part. She was looking at him with those eyes. "Nobody in Wyoming talks like home?" she asked. "Nobody I was finding through the agency, no." She blinked those extraordinary eyes at him, very slowly and deliberately, and then she smiled, and he laughed genuinely. From the chest, and she laughed too. When the laughter settled, she said, "I tried the agency too." He looked at her. "When?" 2 years ago I was 20. She looked out at the tree line. I wrote some letters. It felt foolish almost immediately, writing to strangers and trying to describe myself in a letter. And then I realized I was not actually going to travel 1,000 miles to marry someone I'd never met, so I stopped. "Why didn't you find a match and go?" he asked. "Why didn't you get the hell out of here?" "Because they would have been strangers," she said simply. "I couldn't, it seemed impossible to me, marrying a stranger on arrival." He looked at her for a moment. "Willa," he said, "I live in Wyoming, I'm not a stranger." She went very still. Something passed between them in the moment after he said it, a current, a recognition, and he watched her feel it and he felt it himself, and neither of them looked away. "Tell me about Rock Springs," she said. He told her. He told her about the land, 5,000 acres of high plains grass, the way the light came down flat and golden in the evenings, the quality of the silence that was different from Georgia silence, wider, less humid. He told her about the house, which was large and solid and sat on a rise with a view that went on for miles. He told her how he had gotten the money to start. She was the first person in Georgia he had told, and he told her plainly, because she was someone he trusted with plain things. He told her about flipping houses and businesses in the lean years before the ranch, about the ventures that still paid him without requiring his daily presence. "I'm what they'd call dirty rich out there," he said, "which mostly means I'm still Johnny, I just have more room to be him in." She was listening with her whole attention. The finger pressed to her lower lip in that way she had. He told her about Robert and Anna. He told her Anna's story, all of it, the way Robert had told it, the hard beginning and the long walk and the letter and what it had meant. He told her about the restaurant and Sarah and the particular warmth of that town and those people. "It sounds like something worth going to," Willa said quietly. "Anna would like you," he said. "She's got an eye for people. I'm just in," she stopped herself, tried again. "I look different. People in a new place would think I look strange." "Willa," he turned to face her fully. "You look like yourself, and yourself is something worth looking at." She was very still. "You could come to Wyoming," he said. "If you wanted, there's room, there's work. There are people worth knowing." He held her gaze. "And I would very much like it if you came." She was looking at him with those violet eyes, wide and very serious. "But I'm just an albino," she said, and the old phrase came out differently this time, softer, less a statement than a question or maybe a test. A last test she was giving herself before she stopped giving it. He leaned across the distance between them and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the kind of kiss that asked a question. It was the kind of kiss that answered one. He felt her go still for half a second, and then respond with a completeness that surprised him and shouldn't have, because she was complete in everything else she did. And this was not, apparently, going to be any different. When he pulled back, she had her eyes closed and her lips slightly parted, and she sat that way for a moment before she opened her eyes. "Oh," she said. "Was that your first?" he asked, because he was fairly sure it was and he wanted to know. "Yes," she said without embarrassment. "It was my best," he said. The blush came up in that extraordinary color, and she pressed her lips together and looked out at the tree line and the long Georgia dusk. And he watched the side of her face and felt something settle in his chest like a stone, finding its place at the bottom of a clear stream. The baby came in the middle of a warm May night, which was earlier than expected by 2 weeks, and which nobody was, in retrospect, surprised by. Because Kat Dawson had spent her entire life declining to operate on other people's schedules. Willa got the doctor, and Johnny built up the fire and boiled water, and did the things that men do to feel useful during childbirth, which are mostly things that women don't actually need, but appreciate nonetheless. He sat on the porch step and listened to the sounds from inside and felt his heart beating at a pace that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the moments before certain decisive actions in his life. though this was a different kind of decisive. The baby announced itself at approximately 2 in the morning. The doctor came out first and told him it was a girl, healthy, with strong lungs that she was deploying enthusiastically. Johnny stood up and went inside and found Kat sitting up in the bed with the baby in the crook of her arm, looking at the small red face with an expression that was entirely new. He had never seen Kat look like that particular terrified and devoted combination. "Come see Thomas's daughter," Kat said. He came and looked at the baby and felt something he didn't have a good word for, something compound and full of angles, grief and gratitude and love all at once. "What are you going to call her?" he asked. "Grace," Kat said. "Thomas Grace Wade. Thomas would have liked that." "Thomas would have cried like a fool," Kat said. "Which is what I'm doing." Willa was beside him, and he felt her take his hand in the dark, and he held it. They gave Kat and Grace a month before the subject of Wyoming came up in practical terms. The house sold faster than he had expected. A family from Atlanta, moving south for land prices, put down money within a week of the listing. Johnny had priced it fairly, and the buyer had accepted without a counteroffer, which told him it was priced right. He sat down with Kat and Willa one evening and laid the timeline. "We leave in 6 weeks," he said. "Grace will be 7 weeks old by then, which the doctor says is old enough to travel if we take it slowly." He looked at Willa. "You coming?" She had been coming, he thought, since the evening on the porch, but he asked because she deserved to be asked. "I'm coming," she said. Kat said nothing, but she reached over and patted Willa's hand in a way that managed to convey several years of "I told you so" in a single gesture. "I need to write Robert," Johnny said. "And Anna," Kat said. The name had taken on a particular quality in Kat's mouth over the weeks he'd been describing the Scots. "Tell her we're coming." "She knows," he said. "I wrote her when we set the date." Kat gave him the look she had given him their whole lives, the one that meant she was deciding whether to be annoyed that he had done something before telling her. Then she decided not to be. "What did she say?" He pulled the letter from his breast pocket and read it. She said, and I'm quoting, "Tell those Southern belles they'd better start practicing their poker faces, because Wyoming weather is not going to be impressed by slow drawls and good manners. I'll have a room ready and a pot on the stove, and don't be late." Kat was smiling. Willa was smiling. "She sounds like someone I intend to know very well," Kat said. They traveled by wagon to Atlanta and by train from there, and the train took them further from Georgia with every mile in a way that felt different to each of them. Kat held Grace and looked out the window with the expression of someone watching a country that they have decided to love from now on, rather than the one they grew up in. She was sad about some of it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, but the sadness was clean, the kind that comes from choosing rather than being chosen for. Willa looked out the window at the changing country with a quality of absorption that Johnny had learned was not passivity but its opposite. She was taking in, cataloging, organizing what she saw into something she would hold onto. The plains came up as they moved west, the country opening out in a way that Georgia never did, and he watched her face when it happened. "Lord," she said softly. "It gets bigger," he said. She looked at him. "Better or worse?" "Better," he said. "Once you get used to it." She looked back out the window, and he looked at the side of her face. Rock Springs came on a Tuesday afternoon, with the light going golden across the flats, and the mountains in the distance holding the last of the day. Johnny felt the particular thing he always felt coming home to this country, relief and belonging in equal measure, and something else now, something new, which was seeing it through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. Willa had her face close to the window. "That's it," he said. "That's Rock Springs." She looked at the town and the surrounding country and the mountains behind it, and she said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, in that slow Georgia drawl, "It is the most beautiful place I have ever seen in my life." Kat, holding Grace, looked over Willa's shoulder and said, "It surely is." Robert and Anna were waiting at the station. Robert was exactly as Johnny had described him, broad-shouldered and easy-moving, the kind of man who occupied space without claiming it. He shook Johnny's hand, and then looked at Kat and Willa with the respectful directness of a Westerner, who didn't have a lot of social ceremony to get through before he said what he meant. "Welcome to Wyoming," he said. "We're glad you're here." Anna was 7 months along and radiant with it, and she came forward with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided to love people before she's confirmed she should. She embraced Kat first, carefully, mindful of Grace in Kat's arms, and then she pulled back and looked at the baby with those extraordinary eyes. "Oh," Anna said. "She's beautiful." "She's Thomas's," Kat said, which was the most complete sentence Kat could say about it. Anna put her hand over Kat's and nodded. Then Anna turned to Willa. Willa stood with her posture very straight, the way she stood when she was uncertain about what was coming, and she met Anna's eyes and waited. Anna looked at her fully, the way she looked at people, which was completely and without social performance, and then she smiled. "I see why he was looking for a Southern belle," Anna said. "He'd have had to look a very long time to find one better." Willa's cheeks went that extraordinary rose. "Thank you," she said, in her slow, deep drawl. "Kat told me in her letter that you were worth knowing. I believe she undersold you. Your eyes are violet, they are so beautiful." Willa smiled and said, "Your eyes are unique too," returning the compliment, and Anna laughed a real, delighted laugh and took Willa's arm. The two women walked toward the waiting wagon already talking, the conversation already underway and apparently unlikely to stop, and Robert came to stand beside Johnny and watch them go. "She's something," Robert said quietly. "Yes," Johnny said. Robert looked at him with a slight smile. "Are you going to do something about it?" "Already started," Johnny said. Robert nodded and said nothing further, because he was a man who knew when a thing was settled. Later that evening, at Anna's table in the Scott house, with supper finished and the children, Grace sleeping in the crook of Kat's arm, the Scott children in bed, and the 4 adults sitting with coffee in the long western dusk, Anna leaned across the table and pointed at Kat and Willa and said, "These Southern belles of yours, Johnny Dawson, they talk funny. But I like them." Kat looked at Willa. Willa looked at Kat. "She means the drawl," Willa said to Kat. "I gathered," Kat said. "Everyone out here says that," Johnny said. "You'll get used to it. Or they'll get used to us," Kat said pleasantly, and Robert laughed, and Anna laughed, and even Grace stirred briefly in her sleep as if agreeing with the assessment. Johnny looked around the table, at his sister and her baby, at the friends who had become something close to family, at Willa across the table with the lamplight in her extraordinary hair, and those violet eyes and that smile, and felt the thing settle fully in him that had been settling piece by piece since he had ridden back into Georgia with 4 words in a letter, and found more than he had gone looking for. Home, he thought, not the home he had left, something better, the kind you built from what you chose and who you kept. He looked at Willa and she was already looking at him, and neither of them looked away. Outside, Wyoming held the last light of the day against the mountains for as long as it could, the way beautiful things do, and the evening came on slowly, and the table was warm, and the people around it were exactly where they were supposed to be.